the bitter winter of 1812, in the quiet market town of Ashbourne, Derbyshire, a story unfolded that was not of love, but of cruelty silence, and a fate sealed by ink on paper. It begins with a girl named Eleanor Whitmore, a name that even in her lifetime was spoken more in whispers than in warmth. Today she is remembered only as the widow of Ashbourne. Yet behind that title lies a tale of betrayal, humiliation, and blood. Perhaps you've wondered what becomes of a life when it is traded, not cherished. What shadows linger when a child is bartered away, her voice silenced before it has even learned to plead. Tonight, let us drift back into those dimly lit rooms of the past and listen. The Whitmore family had once lived in modest respectability, but ruin when it came did not arrive with storm or blight. It arrived by the hand of John Whitmore himself, a man hallowed by vice, whose name was spoken not in churches but in taverns over cards and wagers. By the end of that year, his debts had grown so large that not even the farm, nor the house, nor the last thread of his credit could save him. And so pressed by creditors and mocked by neighbors, he reached for the only asset left to him, his daughter, 13 years old, by law a child, by custom a commodity. The man who took her was Edmund Blackwell, 29, with an estate that looked strong on paper but was hollowed like his own heart. The match was no union of love, nor even of respect. It was a settlement, a bargain struck in desperation and sealed with a quill. One December evening in a solicitor's office, lit by candles that guttered in the draught, John Whitmore signed away his child's future. The witnesses recorded his trembling hand, though whether from shame, drink, or relief, they could not say. Edmund Blackwell's signature followed in a steady, deliberate script, as though cruelty was simply business. The contract was stark in its language. Eleanor herself was not present. Her name was written as though she were a piece of land or livestock to be conveyed. On that night, while men whispered and ink dried, she lay asleep in her narrow bed, unaware that her life had been wagered as carelessly as her father's coin. She did not yet know that Edmund Blackwell, 16 years her senior, now held the right to claim her. She did not yet know that her protests, should they ever come, would mean nothing. By the time she was told the signatures of men had already bound her to a future, she could not escape. And so it was that in the final days of 1812, a childhood ended not with death nor illness, but by transaction. On a grey morning in January of 1813, the bells of Ashbourne Parish Church rang, not in joy, but in duty. Guests filled the pews, but their faces bore no smiles. They came not for celebration, but for obligation. A debt had been settled, and this was its public proof. Into that cold and echoing church walked Eleanor Whitmore, scarcely 13, her small frame wrapped in a dress that hung awkwardly from her shoulders. Her father escorted her, but there was no tenderness in his grip. Witnesses remembered her pale face, her bewildered eyes cast downward. She did not speak, nor lift her gaze. At the altar stood Edmund Blackwell, tall, rigid, a man of nearly 30. His reputation was already marked by severity. And when he first looked upon his bride, it was not with courtesy, but contempt. Those standing close swore they heard him mutter the word, dowdy, plain unworthy, spoken loud enough to wound before clergy family and neighbors alike. The cruelty of the marriage was revealed before it even began. The vicar did not pause. The liturgy of the Book of Common Prayer carried on solemn and unyielding, filling the air with words that bound two lives together. But if you listen closely, perhaps you too can hear the silence beneath those words. The silence of a child who could not yet comprehend that her life was no longer her own. The congregation followed the words of the vicar, almost mechanically, their voices subdued as though each person wished to lend as little life as possible to a ceremony they could not in good conscience celebrate. Eleanor stood motionless, her lips moving only when required. Her responses whispered, fragile, almost inaudible. She was present in body, yet absent in power, more symbol than participant. Edmund, by contrast, spoke with precision. His vows were uttered clearly, firmly, without a tremor of hesitation. His eyes never softened. The transaction was not only sealed on parchment, but in the very tone of his voice. The vicar's blessing came and went, binding the two together before God and community. But the moment contained no tenderness, no gesture of partnership. Those who witnessed it recalled unease rippling through the pews. Some looked away from the bowed head of the bride. Others stiffened at the groom's open disdain. Yet, not a word of protest was spoken. How could there be? The contract had been signed, the debt settled, and the law itself now sanctified the bargain. To object would have been to challenge the very foundation of society, a society that saw daughters as negotiable property and marriage as a tool of commerce. When the service ended, the bells of Ashbourne rang again. Their chime carried over the rooftops and into the streets, but their meaning was hollow. There were no garlands, no laughter spilling from the churchyard gate. Only a solemn procession, the sound of obligation disguised as matrimony. The records tell us nothing of Eleanor's expression as she walked beside her husband into this new life. Only that she moved in silence, her steps dictated by the pace of others rather than her own will. Edmund's face was set, his jaw rigid, his gaze fixed forward. And so it was done. Husband and wife, bound by law and by scripture, yet utterly devoid of love. The bells tolled not for joy but for debt repaid. The marriage solemnized in January of 1813 produced no shared life. Within days of the ceremony, Edmund was gone. His absences were explained as business, though records show visits to London clubs, long stays in Bath, and eventually travels abroad. It was not duty that drew him away, but preference. His absence was deliberate, and its consequence was immediate. A young bride, scarcely more than a child, left abandoned in a house that was not hers among servants who did not belong to her. The Blackwell estate, though diminished in wealth, still loomed grand in structure. Its high-ceilinged rooms echoing with emptiness, its corridors narrow and cold, its chambers long unused. For 13-year-old Eleanor, torn from the modest warmth of her father's house, the great estate did not represent splendor, but vacancy. Its silence became her companion. The servants recalled that she was placed not in the master's chambers, but in a small nursery room. Left behind by another generation, its furniture undersized its walls, marked with fading traces of childhood past. The choice of room was deliberate, a reminder that she was present in name only, not yet acknowledged as mistress of the household. No instructions came from Edmund beyond the most basic provisions: meals to be served, discipline to be maintained, and boundaries never to be crossed. She was confined to the house and its walled gardens, excluded from county gatherings, from neighborly visits, from any semblance of society. She was invisible. It was the servants, pitying her in their quiet way, who gave her a name. They whispered of her not as wife or mistress, but as the ghost. A maid would later testify that Eleanor drifted through the corridors like a shadow, seen but seldom heard. Others remembered her small figure, passing silently through the vast rooms, as if swallowed by the emptiness around her. She became the ghost wife, a title born not of malice, but of sorrow, a recognition that she lived in the house, yet was not of it. In truth, such isolation was not unknown in the 19th century. Child brides were often sequestered until they could be properly presented. Husbands pursued their pleasures without the burden of a wife too young to accompany them. But what made Eleanor's case exceptional was the absence of any preparation, any education, any path to grow into her role. She was not groomed for society. She was not guided toward duty. She was simply left, and so her days blurred together, marked by long hours of reading when books could be found, or stitching when needle and cloth were given. More often, they were filled with silence. Servants remained polite, but distant, their loyalty pledged to Edmund, not the child bride he had purchased. From the outside, the marriage that had once been whispered about in Ashbourne's taverns and drawing rooms seemed to vanish altogether. Edmund was seen often in London gaming halls, in Bath's promenades, in the company of acquaintances abroad. Eleanor, however, was not seen at all. She bore the name of wife, but none of its protections. The disparity of years between them widened into a chasm of neglect. One clergyman would later describe her condition as a living widowhood. A child left to wander halls too vast for her, her presence more spectral than real. But in the autumn of 1813, everything changed. Edmund returned to Ashbourne, and with his return the silence of neglect gave way to something darker. His absence had been marked by indifference. His presence would be marked by cruelty. The silence that had once cloaked young Eleanor Whitmore was broken, but not by kindness, not by the soft murmur of companionship. Instead, it was replaced with sharp commands, barked orders that rang through the halls of the Blackwell estate, like whips striking stone. At 29, Edmund carried not only the weight of years, but the force of absolute authority. His wife, barely turned 14, had no shield against it. The imbalance was written into every gesture, every routine. She was not trained for the quiet refinements of a mistress of a house. No, her duties were those of a servant. She scrubbed the floors until her hands burned raw. She carried heavy buckets of water across echoing corridors. She washed linens until her fingers bled, polished boots until she saw her own hollow-eyed reflection staring back. These tasks, menial as they were, carried a darker purpose. They were not meant to preserve the estate, but to erode her dignity. Servants watching from the shadows later spoke of it in plain terms. Every command Edmund gave seemed sharpened with mockery. When Eleanor faltered, he laughed at her clumsiness. When she succeeded, he dismissed her efforts as paltry. She was never allowed to feel capable, never permitted to believe she might be anything more than inadequate, and the cruelty was not contained to the walls of the estate. On more than one occasion, Edmund turned humiliation into theatre. He invited neighbors, acquaintances, drinking companions, men and women of the county into his house. But the gatherings were not for feasting nor for conversation. They were staged demonstrations. Before their eyes, Eleanor was ordered to serve food and wine, her small hands trembling beneath the weight of trays larger than her arms could bear. She was sent to fetch objects on command, to kneel at the hearth and scrub the stones while the guests looked on. One visitor, unable to forget what he had witnessed, wrote in a private letter that the girl's silence was more haunting than her labor. She never protested, never spoke. And Edmund laughed at her awkwardness as though it were entertainment. Those present knew they were witnessing cruelty. Yet, not one spoke out. To do so would have been to question the unspoken order of things. He was the husband, she his possession. And so, silence prevailed, just as it always had. What emerged in that household was a ritual of subjugation. Affection was absent, and in its place came dominance practiced with precision. Every command stripped Eleanor further of selfhood. Every public display of her obedience reminded the community of Edmund's power not just over a house, but over a life. Whispers spread beyond the estate walls. Servants carried the stories in hushed tones. In taverns, at market stalls, in the quiet corners of parlors, people began to speak of the Blackwell girl, a phrase that no longer suggested mystery, but degradation. By the winter of 1814, her transformation was plain to all who looked closely. What had once been a bewildered child was now something else entirely obedient, mechanical, emptied of resistance. Servants observed the change with unease. They said she rose before dawn without prompting, that she anticipated Edmund's orders before he even spoke them, carrying out her duties with the mechanical rhythm of someone who no longer distinguished between choice and command. Her movements grew precise, almost unnatural. She fetched, carried, scrubbed, polished, never pausing, never questioning. The only words she seemed to speak were, "Yes, sir," or "No, sir." Even neighbors noticed. Some glimpsed her at the water pump, her face pale, her eyes hollow, her silence impenetrable. One farmer's wife described her as looking less like a girl and more like an animal trained to follow. The comparison spread whispered, first in kitchens, then repeated in taverns until it reached Edmund himself. And Edmund, always eager to twist cruelty into spectacle, embraced it. At one gathering, as Eleanor knelt on the cold floor scrubbing stone, he smirked and referred to her before the assembled guests as "my goat." Laughter followed, not out of amusement, but out of fear. For in such a moment, silence felt safer than defiance. From that night, the name stuck. Servants used it. Neighbors repeated it. And Eleanor, perhaps worst of all, absorbed it. This is the darkest cruelty, not the insult itself, but the permanence of it. With each repetition, her humanity was diminished further until the world no longer saw her as a girl, nor even as a wife, but as livestock. Her behavior shifted in turn. She no longer resisted. Heavy pails of water, blistering hearths, endless labor, all were endured without complaint. This was not acceptance. It was survival. A silent recognition that resistance would only bring harsher reprisal. Thus, the estate, once a hollow prison of silence, became instead a stage of humiliation. The ghost bride had become something else, a creature stripped of identity, a girl whose very name was replaced by mockery. And still the story of Eleanor Whitmore was only beginning. The servants, though privately sympathetic, played their part in reinforcing the cruelty. Within the Blackwell estate, they no longer addressed her as Mrs. Blackwell. Instead, she was simply the girl. That single choice of words erased both her station and her maturity. In the hierarchy of the household, she ranked below even the hired staff. She commanded no authority, no respect, and no voice. Beyond the gates, neighbors too adjusted their perception. When Eleanor was seen walking to market or at the well, she was not recognized as wife or daughter, but merely as an extension of Edmund's will. Conversations rarely included her name. Instead, she was referenced obliquely as the goat, the ghost, the girl at Blackwell's. Each whispered phrase stripped away another fragment of identity. This was the midpoint of her decline. Silence had erased her presence. Cruelty had reshaped her behavior. And now, mockery extinguished her name. By the early months of 1815, Eleanor Whitmore was no longer seen as a child of her family, nor as the young bride of a notable estate. She existed only as property animated by command. The names others gave her clung like a brand, scarring deeper than blows. Then, in the spring of that year, something occurred, something outside the walls of Blackwell House that would disturb the pattern. It was not directed at her. It did not involve her husband. It was to most a passing moment of street violence. But to Eleanor, it was decisive. She had been sent on an errand, walking the narrow lane that wound from Ashburn's Market Square toward the estate. Her head was lowered, her pace slow, her silence as habitual as breath. It was then she came upon the scene. An older woman, small in stature, was cornered against a hedge by a man with a knife. His voice was brutal and direct. Her purse, her shawl, her coin. All that she had. Yet what followed was not what Eleanor expected. The woman, though frail in body, resisted. She clawed at his arm, shouted so fiercely that it startled even him. For a brief moment, the lane was chaos, steel flashing cloth tearing a voice louder than her ears should have allowed. The thief faltered under that sudden force of will. He fled, leaving the woman shaken, but intact, her possessions preserved. Eleanor did not intervene. She stood apart an observer rather than participant. But she lingered long enough to see the woman gather her things with trembling hands and straighten her shawl, still breathing hard. And though no words passed between them, the impression was fixed in Eleanor's mind. For her, the lesson was startling. She had come to believe weakness meant helplessness, that silence was the only answer to power. But here in the dusty lane outside Ashbourne, she saw proof otherwise. A frail body could resist. Survival could be won through refusal. The woman was not triumphant in any grand sense, but she had not surrendered. Such moments, small in scale, often serve as catalysts. They shift the mind from inevitability to possibility. And within Eleanor, that shift began. Servants later noted subtle changes. She moved differently with the deliberation not present before. Her silence was no longer vacant, but listening, as if she were waiting for something within herself to be spoken. Outwardly, her obedience continued, but the mechanical quality had lessened. She was no longer a puppet of reflex. There was thought stirring behind her eyes. The incident soon vanished from town record, one robbery among many in restless Derbyshire. But its echo persisted inside the estate walls. Eleanor had seen weakness resist, and the thought haunted her. If frailty could strike back, why not she? By summer of 1815, she had endured over 2 years of humiliation. Yet now a decision had hardened quietly within her. She would attempt to speak. The chance arrived in late July, when Edmund returned from a week's absence in Derby. Eleanor was at her usual post by the hearth, her hands raw from scrubbing. But this time she did not remain kneeling. She rose, approached him with an unusual steadiness, and for the first time in their marriage, she spoke words of her own choosing. Her voice did not tremble. She told him plainly that their union was meaningless, that he had treated her not as wife but as servant, that she had lived in silence while mocked, degraded, and reduced to spectacle. She did not beg for freedom, only for dignity, the recognition of her role as wife rather than goat. Witnesses' servants who overheard from the corners of the room recalled Edmund's reaction. He laughed. It was sharp, unrestrained laughter, the kind that mocks the very notion of her defiance. He called her child, reminded her of her age, her debt, her place. His amusement was real, but beneath it lay something colder, a cruelty that saw her voice not as threat, but as absurdity. The exchange might have ended with silence. Her small voice swallowed. Once more had Eleanor not repeated herself. This time her words were steadier, firmer. She told him she could not continue, as she had, that a life spent in degradation was no life at all. It was that second insistence which cracked Edmund's mask of amusement. Anger surged suddenly, violently. He seized her by the arm, dragging her from the hearth toward the doorway. Servants, startled, scattered out of the way as his voice rose, each accusation sharper than the last, mocking her presumption, condemning her ingratitude. The noise carried. Neighbors would later recall hearing the commotion. Out in the courtyard, before the eyes of those drawn to the gate, Edmund struck her. He forced her to her knees, shouting that she was nothing, that she belonged to him as fully as the soil beneath their feet. The public nature of the assault was deliberate. Where once her humiliation had been staged only for guests within the estate, now it was displayed openly, a performance of ownership meant to silence not only Eleanor, but any whisper of her resistance. The neighbors, unsettled but silent, did not intervene. In Ashbourne of the early 19th century, a husband's authority was regarded as absolute. What was seen that day was spoken of quietly but never challenged. From that moment, Edmund's cruelty had escalated from private ridicule into public violence. For Eleanor, the lesson was unmistakable. Words would not alter her condition. Reason would not deliver dignity. Her attempt at speech had ended not in dialogue, but in blows. After that summer of 1815, Eleanor no longer tried to plead, but her silence did not collapse into passivity as before. Instead, it hardened. Servants noticed the change. She carried out her tasks with the same outward composure, but with an attentiveness that unsettled those who observed her closely. She listened with precision to the rhythms of the household, the hours of Edmund's dining, the patterns of his absence, the small consistencies of his routine. What seemed like dutiful labor concealed something else: calculation. Clinical accounts of endurance under cruelty often describe this progression: submission, despair, and finally adaptation through strategy. Eleanor's rage, once inward and dissolving, began to crystallize into deliberate thought. She no longer asked why she suffered. She began to ask how it might end. Escape was impossible. Confrontation futile. What remained was subtlety. And so her mind turned toward poison. It required no strength, no open defiance, no witnesses. It was silent, concealed, methodical, an echo of the life she had been forced to live. Just as her degradation had been administered slowly, invisibly, so too could her response arrive unnoticed until it was final. Servants remembered seeing her at the market selecting herbs under the pretense of household remedies. Foxglove, belladonna, hemlock. Common enough in rural homes, their legitimate uses well known, their dangers better known still. To others, her purchases seemed unremarkable. To her, they were pieces of design. Within the estate, her demeanor reflected the same shift. She no longer flinched at Edmund's voice. She worked with steady composure, unhurried, her silence no longer vacant, but watchful. Those who saw her closely described her eyes as still, almost unnervingly, so as though some quiet calculation was always unfolding behind them. From a distance, this was the conversion of suffering into agency. Her speech had been stripped away, her identity mocked, her dignity erased. What remained was intent. Cold, deliberate, unspoken. By the autumn of 1815, the weight pressing upon Edmund Blackwell was not only his wife's quiet resolve, but his own financial ruin. Though heir to a notable estate, his reckless gaming in Derby and London, his debts to taverns and speculative ventures had caught up with him. Creditors who had long waited arrived at Ashbourne not with patience, but with threats. 3 men, tradesmen of modest standing, but firm demand, entered the estate not as guests, but as collectors. They carried ledgers, recited figures, pressed their claims with a tone edged in warning. The confrontation took place in the dining room. Servants stood nearby, witnesses forbidden to interfere. Edmund dismissed the figures with contempt, waving away their calculations, insisting repayment would come in due course. His posture conveyed arrogance, but his creditors pressed harder, unmoved by his pretense of control. Their patience, they said, had reached its limit. What had once been framed as business had shifted into the territory of survival. Voices sharpened. One of the men, later identified in testimony as a supplier of spirits, leaned across the table and delivered a phrase that would never leave Eleanor Whitmore's memory. "The next cup you drink may be your last." The remark was half metaphor, half menace, but its weight was unmistakable. Edmund's temper flared. He struck the table with his palm, demanding that the men leave at once. They did not. They lingered, reminding him of debts unpaid and consequences looming, seizure of land, ruin of reputation, perhaps worse. Only after minutes of insults and raised voices did they finally withdraw, leaving Edmund pacing the floor, flushed with rage. The household staff, who had stood nearby, later wrote down what they saw. Thoreau noted how Eleanor remained in her customary place at the edge of the room, quietly refilling cups and clearing dishes. She neither spoke nor stirred beyond her duties. Yet, behind that stillness, she listened. The creditor's words, "The next cup you drink may be your last," lodged themselves deep within her. Until that moment, her intentions had been solitary, conceived in silence, shielded within her mind. But now the world had furnished her with something she could not have created herself, a threat, spoken aloud, heard by others. If Edmund were to die, suddenly suspicion might not rest solely on her. Blame would drift almost naturally toward the men who had uttered menace and carried grievance. Later medical notes would call this moment decisive. Opportunity when joined with intent converts calculation into action. The creditors had given Eleanor the alibi she lacked. They had, without realizing it, provided her with the cover to proceed. Edmund, still simmering with anger, demanded more wine, dismissing the threat as drunken bluster. To him, the men were pests, to be swatted aside with arrogance. To Eleanor, they had become unwitting accomplices. Their menace had cleared the path. That night, the estate resumed its rhythm. Edmund drank heavily. Servants drifted through their tasks. Eleanor moved silently among them, but in her silence lay a conclusion. The creditor's threat would serve as her shield. Their words would become her weapon. By the final months of 1815, her plan had ripened into action. What had been months of watchfulness and quiet preparation narrowed into one course. Edmund Blackwell would die not in open confrontation but by poison slipped into his cup during the ordinary rituals of his own household. The tools she gathered were neither foreign nor exotic. Country estates kept stores of medicinal herbs meant for fever, sleeplessness, stomach pains. Among them lay plants whose reputation straddled cure and death: hemlock, belladonna foxglove. Eleanor, under the guise of household duty, secured access to them all. She studied their textures, their bitterness, the ways they might be concealed in broth or wine. Servants later remembered her leaning at the hearth longer than usual, stirring pots with uncommon focus or requesting more spices to mask unfamiliar tastes. None of it seemed strange in a household where wives were expected to shoulder labor without pause. Wine was her chosen vessel, deep, pungent, and capable of masking even the harshest tinctures. Edmund drank it in excess, particularly in the evenings. And so she selected her moment, a night when the house was quiet, servants scattered, and Edmund already dulled by drink. The scene bore no mark of drama. Edmund sat at the head of the table, boots still dirtied from the yard, his voice carrying commands as though the supper were another stage for authority. Eleanor poured without a tremor. Into his cup, she had placed the tincture not enough to kill outright, but to weaken to make his decline seem like sudden illness. Edmund raised the cup. He drank, then paused, remarking that the wine was uncommonly smooth. A servant standing nearby would later recall those words etched in memory with cruel irony. The compliment was not to vineyard or vintage, but to the substance that had already begun its work. Eleanor, standing at his side, betrayed no flicker of expression. The decline was deliberate, though it appeared at first like a weariness. Edmund continued to drink, his voice rising in mockery, as it so often did, his laughter swelling, until it seemed to fill the hall. Yet beneath the noise, his body betrayed him. His words blurred. His hand trembled on the stem of the cup. He cursed creditors, cursed labor, cursed the weight of his estate, insisting the weakness was nothing more than fatigue. But the falter spread visible in the slump of his shoulders, the pallor of his skin. Servants lingered at the edges of the room, uncertain whether they should move to his aid. Eleanor remained composed. She cleared dishes, poured another measure, set the cup gently before him. Edmund lifted it again, swallowing down the very substance that hastened his undoing. From the cool eye of hindsight, the act resembled an experiment dosage. Calculated concealment, perfected timing, aligned with the quiet of the household. There was nothing reactive in her movements. Every gesture was chosen. Years of silence had become method. As his strength drained, Edmund slumped back, muttering with a slur that the wine carried an unusual richness. It was his final toast offered to the poison that was unmaking him. His grip loosened. The cup slipped rolling across the table, spilling a dark stain across the wood. His voice fell silent, and with it, the household. For Eleanor, the moment carried no tremor. What humiliation had inflicted for years was answered with one measured reply. Each sip Edmund took had narrowed the distance between cruelty and silence. But with his death came the problem of appearance. Poison in the home, if discovered, would point naturally toward the quiet wife who poured his wine. To escape suspicion, she would need to turn private death into public murder. The creditors had already offered her the answer. Their threat. "The next cup you drink may be your last," had been overheard. If Edmund's body were found not in his house, but in the open, staged as retribution, suspicion would bend toward them. After midnight, when servants had retired, she began the work. Edmund's body, heavy and inert, sat slumped at the table. She pulled a cloak around his shoulders to mask the stiffness of death, then braced herself for the effort. The task demanded strength beyond her size, but necessity gave her endurance. His boots thudded dully against carpet as she dragged him through the hall. At the threshold she froze, listening for movement. Hearing none, she opened the door and drew him out into the night. The air was sharp. The streets of Ashbourne empty. Lamps sputtered low, casting broken shadows. She pulled his weight along narrow lanes, pausing, often adjusting his limbs to soften the signs of dragging. The faint tracks still marked the dirt. Her destination was the market square, where the dawn's first workers would find him. Beneath the looming church tower, she let his body fall into place. Then came the final touch. From her cloak she drew a note written in a hand, careful yet unpracticed. "This is the fate of men who fail their deaths." She pinned it to his coat. The message needed no art. It pointed directly to the men whose threats were already known. She arranged his cloak, set his arms in a posture of collapse, and stepped back. The square absorbed the silence. Turning, she retraced her way to the estate, extinguished her lamp, and lay in her chamber without a sound. Observers later remarked on the clinical precision of the act. At no point did Eleanor falter. Each step had been prepared, each risk accounted for. The strain of dragging a man twice her weight did not dissuade her. What years of humiliation had taught her was endurance and endurance. She had applied to concealment. By dawn, the body of Edmund Blackwell lay beneath the tower, and the town stirred with shock, though not with surprise. His creditors had been loud in their anger. Their menace had been heard by many. The note pinned to his coat seemed only to confirm what was already believed. Within hours, the story fixed itself. Edmund Blackwell, undone by his deaths, had fallen victim to vengeance. And Eleanor Whitmore, just 14 years old, was recast, not as architect, but as casualty. A child bride widowed by circumstance. The girl once whispered about in tones of pity and scandal was now spoken of in terms of sorrow and misfortune. The funeral became her stage. Those who gathered that day remembered a young girl at the front of the church, clothed in deep mourning black, her pale face lifted now and again toward the high windows. Her body trembled. Her sobs filled the nave, unrestrained, echoing beneath the vaulted ceiling. The servants later swore her grief was unstudied, that her weeping seemed too raw to be rehearsed. And yet, when one looks closely, the pattern begins to emerge. Her tears fell at the right moments, when scripture was read, when the coffin was lowered, when Edmund's name rang out across the stone walls. Between these episodes, she steadied herself, drew in even breaths, let her eyes meet those of the congregation. Each glance was a plea, silent yet powerful, weaving the image of a child bowed by tragedy. The people responded as she knew they would. Women whispered prayers for her future, pitying the years already stolen. Men shook their heads, condemning Edmund's cruelty, cursing his waste. Food arrived at her door, small coins pressed into her hands. Neighbors came not seeking favor, but to ease her hardship. Eleanor accepted all with quiet gratitude. She never explained, never protested, never spoke beyond her role as widow. The manipulation lay not in her words, but in her silence. She did not need to tell a story. The town told it for her. They called her the poor widow, the child abandoned, the innocent caught in ruin. Every title was a shield. And by speaking less, she allowed their sympathy to grow unchecked. In early 19th century England, a widow was judged by her mourning. Pale face, trembling frame, tears at the right moments, withdrawal from society, these were the marks of virtue. Eleanor embodied them all with precision. Whether her sorrow was genuine or not hardly mattered. In the eyes of the town, appearance became truth. Even those who had once pitied her humiliation reframed their memories. Cruelty once spoken of in whispers now became proof of her victimhood. A girl degraded had become a girl wronged. And with that, her safety was secured. No one questioned her role at the last meal. No one lingered on the sight of her pouring wine into Edmund's cup. The creditors bore the burden instead. Their words of menace had been overheard. Their reputations made them convenient villains. Still, not everyone was convinced. The death of Edmund Blackwell did not rest easily in Ashbourne. The note pinned to his coat seemed too blunt, too deliberate. This was not the quiet vengeance the town was used to. It felt staged, as if someone had wanted it found, and so an inquiry began. First informal, then more insistent, as Edmund's surviving kin demanded answers. The creditors were questioned. They admitted their anger, yes, their frustration, their threats of seizure. But murder? They denied it all. They called the note a fabrication, a false hand meant to point in their direction. Their reasoning was sound, but their reputations made them weak. Who would believe men already known for hardness, already despised for their collections? The town divided. Some accepted the simplest tale creditors had delivered on their threat. Others muttered doubts. If revenge was truly their goal, why leave a body in the square exposed to dawn and discovery? Why not let him vanish quietly, as so many others had before? Questions hung in the air unanswered. In the midst of this, all eyes turned to Eleanor. Her neighbors noted her composure, her calmness unusual in one so young. At 14, she wore widow's dress as though born to it, each gesture deliberate, every word measured. Some whispered her grief was too precise, too disciplined. Yet, in a society that admired outward restraint, suspicion could not settle. Investigators found nothing to hold against her. The servants told only that she had poured the wine, as she always did. None admitted to seeing what she had stirred into it. No science existed to test for poisons. The scuff marks along the estate's lane, evidence of a body dragged, were dismissed as the work of men who had staged the note. The absence of proof became her defense. The inquiry closed without charges. The creditors, though never convicted, carried the stain of suspicion. Their trade faltered, their names darkened. Eleanor, meanwhile, stepped away untouched. Her image intact, transformed from degraded wife into piteous widow. Ashbourne longed for justice, but justice never touched her. Suspicion circled, but like smoke, it never settled. With the inquiry over, Eleanor moved into a new life. At 14, she was widow-heiress mistress of Edmund's estate. What had once been a prison of humiliation now became her platform for reinvention. She stepped forward into public view. No longer confined to silent chambers, she hosted, visitors accepted condolences, presided over meals. She directed her servants with quiet authority. Neighbors who once whispered pity now whispered respect. Sympathy buttressed her new role after all she had suffered at the hands of a cruel husband, then suffered again through his death. To question her was to appear heartless. The transformation was complete. The same community that had watched her degradation now carried out her orders. She survived not only through action but through perception. And yet, something lingered. Servants spoke of her strange habits walking the halls at night, stopping before locked doors, extinguishing lamps again and again as if to test the darkness. She ate sparingly, pushing food aside as if uncertain of its taste. When startled, her hands clenched, her shoulders tightened, as though she braced for blows that no longer came. The estate, too, bore scars. The rooms where Edmund had humiliated her were locked, their contents veiled in dust-covered cloth. The great dining hall where he mocked her as my goat lay abandoned for months, avoided as though silence might erase its memory. In the eyes of the law, she was secure. With no heirs to contest her and no evidence to accuse her, the estate passed wholly to Eleanor Whitmore. Relatives who might have challenged her claim stayed silent. None wished to stir scandal further. She had remade herself in full view of the town. But what remained behind those locked doors and what told its silent secrecy and survival take on a girl scarcely 14? The creditors, weakened by suspicion, no longer held leverage. Ashbourne accepted her as a widow, of means her authority legitimized not by affection but by the absence of challenge. On the surface, Eleanor had won. Yet freedom is rarely so simple. She had removed Edmund, but she had not erased the years of humiliation he carved into her. Those who knew her closely remarked on the stillness of her face, the precise way her hands moved, the absence of laughter. She controlled her surroundings, yes, but could not shed the habits of fear. Each gesture carried echoes of what she had endured. Thus, Eleanor Whitmore entered her new life no longer a servant, no longer invisible, no longer a target of cruelty. She was mistress of the Blackwell estate, cloaked in sympathy, insulated by wealth. And yet, Each day held reminders in her silences, in her careful restraint, in the locked rooms of the house that no one entered. She was no longer a wife, but not yet free of his shadow. In the decades that followed Edmund Blackwell's death, her name never left the whispers of Ashbourne. She remained at the estate through her early adulthood, managing its affairs with quiet efficiency. Visitors described her as dignified, composed, markedly reserved. She never remarried, never sought the wider society that wealth might have opened to her. Her life was contained within the estate and parish, steady and unremarkable on the surface, but always shadowed by the way her husband had died. The town remembered her in fragments. To some, she was the tragic child bride forced into marriage at 13, humiliated and public widowed before maturity. They saw survival as endurance, composure as inner strength. In their telling, she was a victim twice over, first to her father's debts, then to Edmund's cruelty. A girl who bore suffering in silence and emerged with dignity. Others whispered differently, especially the older generation who had seen her transformation firsthand from frightened child to poised widow in a single night. They recalled the creditor's threats, yes, but also Eleanor's composure after Edmund's death. Her tears perfectly timed her silence too convenient. The note pinned to his coat, too deliberate, too staged. To them, she had seized an opportunity, framed the creditors, and worn her silence like a veil. No proof ever surfaced. The poison, if poison, it was left no trace in a time before chemical tests. The scuff marks in the dirt, evidence of a dragged body, were dismissed as someone else's clumsy work. The inquiry closed without conclusion, leaving only speculation. Eleanor herself never spoke of that night. When conversation turned to her husband, she limited herself to formal acknowledgements, his death, the debts, the burdens he left behind. She never defended him, never condemned him. She never explained, never denied. Her silence preserved her, and so the community divided. To the sympathetic, she embodied resilience, the widow of Ashbourne, a figure to pity and respect. To the doubtful, she embodied calculation, a girl who rid herself of a cruel master and slipped past justice. Both versions endured, neither proven, both repeated until they hardened into legend. From a distance, her story reveals the fragility of truth when buried beneath reputation. In the absence of evidence, competing narratives survive side by side. One casts her as victim of circumstance, the other as architect of escape. The truth, whatever it was, remained sealed behind her composure, locked in the same silence that had once saved her. Eleanor Whitmore died in 1852 at the age of 53. Her burial was attended by townspeople who still called her the widow. The estate passed quietly to distant relatives, her line extinguished. And yet, even at her grave, the question lingered. Who had she truly been? The child sold by her father's desperation, scarred forever by cruelty she never sought. Or the calculating young widow who turned poison into freedom, humiliation into strategy. The records, the testimonies, the whispers of Ashbourne never resolved the matter. History remembers her as the widow of Ashbourne, but history cannot decide whether to absolve or condemn her. And so, Eleanor's story ends in silence. A widow, mourned by some, suspected by others. Was she freed by courage or consumed by rage? That answer may never be known, but perhaps you have your own thoughts. Tell me, was Eleanor a victim Or was she something more dangerous? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you'd like to hear more stories of dark history and quiet horror, remember to like this video, subscribe to Sleepy History Tales, and ring the bell. Because the past is never as silent as it seems.